Well, Brad was supposed to be on this weekend, but as of yesterday, he has been sick for like 5 days straight. So I got the call yesterday afternoon to come off the bench, so you're stuck with me. Normally, we're just kind of tracking through Galatians, and we're going to hit a few of the verses that at the end of the text here, where we left off last week. But what I want to do today is I want to kind of circle back and look at a different angle to the Abraham, Ishmael, and Isaac story that we kind of covered last week. Now, the big idea today is that God is gracious even to the outcast. Now, by definition, an outcast is a person that has been rejected by society or from some social setting. Today, we might say that they've been canceled. I mean, there was a lot of that over the last few years, right? In ancient Greece, it was customary to write a person's name on a piece of broken pottery and then later place it into a large container in a public location if someone had behaved in a manner that was deemed overly aggressive or offensive. These broken pieces of pottery were called ostraka. Now, if an individual were to have his or her name written 6,000 times, the entire community would give that person the silent treatment for 10 years. So basically, in America, nobody would be talking to any politicians for the next 6 or 10 years, right? This process became known as ostracizing. That's what this process was. These people were called outcasts. Now, some people do things which make them outcasts. Maybe they are selfish, maybe they don't listen, maybe they're immature, maybe they don't cooperate, maybe they can't read social situations very well, they like to argue a ton, they're loud or distracting or inappropriate at times, they're negative, they're narcissistic, they are aggressive, they dress maybe a certain way, they have different beliefs than the community around them, they have different hobbies or different interests, or they post a lot of fake news. Other people just are things which make them outcasts from a society. Maybe they're male or female, and so they get separated as an outcast in society. Maybe it's their looks or intelligence, their ethnicity, they're poor, they're rich, they're healthy or unhealthy, they have a disability, they're single, or they're married. Any of these areas can create division and cause social exclusion. It's experienced in tribes in the bush, all the way up to Ivy League schools. You see it on social media, you see it in places of employment, nations and societies. Maybe you were not good enough, you didn't have the right lineage, you weren't raised right, you raised your kids differently, whether on purpose or not. Most of us, though, perhaps at some time, especially if you went to middle school, have felt like an outcast, right? Most of us have felt that space at some point. Now, the big question today is, how does God actually deal with those that have been ostracized? How does God deal with the outcast? Because at first glance, honestly, last week, it didn't look real good. Like if you read the allegory story that Paul used to kind of separate law and gospel, law and promise, it didn't look good for one of those guys. What was that story? I'm going to reread it to you right now, what we covered last week, and then we're going to deep dive. It says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law," remember we talked all that through, we did all of the theology stuff on this last week, "do you not listen to the law? For it is written, Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman, Hagar, and one by a free woman, Sarah. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically, which is what Paul does. These women are 2 covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, the law, bearing children from slavery. She is Hagar. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, which Paul talked about last week was Judaism, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband. Now you, brothers, like Isaac, the promised one, right? The children of promise. But just as at that time he was born according to the flesh, persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the scripture say? This is where it gets a little brutal. Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Remember from last week, Paul basically took this Old Testament story, kind of crammed it all in, and then he uses a historical story that actually happened as an allegory about literally casting out the law in order for us to be justified. That no one trying to be justified by the law is going to make it. Doesn't work. But if you have any bit of empathy for the actual story that took place, you might be wondering, as you read that, you might be wondering if God treated outcasts like Ishmael and Hagar like that, then maybe how is he going to treat me? Like, am I just going to get cast off? Like, what if I don't make it? If the emphasis is just get rid of them personally, which is what happened in the story, what's going to happen to me? So what I want to do today is I want us to bounce back to Genesis 21, where that actual story took place. Genesis chapter 21, and recap and see how did the story fully play out? What really happened to Hagar? What really happened to Ishmael? So starting in verse 8, Genesis 21, it says, and the child, speaking of the promised child Isaac that was given to Abraham and Sarah, grew, and he was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. If you recall from last week, Isaac is this promised son that was given to Abraham and Sarah. Took about 25 years for the promise to actually come to pass. They were in their 70s at the time when they were told that they were going to have this child. And so now this child has just been weaned. And in light of that, they throw him a big, big party, right? This is totally like first mom syndrome right here, right? You celebrate everything. So Sarah's pretty happy, even though she's like 90 years old. It's different when you get to kid number 4, right? Those of you that have like multiple kids, with kid number 4, you don't have parties. They're lucky if they just get kind of a combined party, maybe with some of their other siblings, or just kind of thrown in there with Christmas, even though their birthday's in July. Right, so with kid number 4, you're just kind of like, has anyone even seen kid number 4? I thought I saw him. Maybe it was last week. That's kind of where it goes. But this is kid number 1 for them. They're super excited. So kid number 1 gets a really, really big feast. It's a big day. He's 2 to 3 years of age. But at this party, something happened. It said, but Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian woman, she had born to Abraham, laughing, right? So this son is now picking a fight. Remember, Hagar is the woman that came home with Abraham when Abraham went down into Egypt due to a famine, and he gave his wife away. We talked about this last week, into Pharaoh's like harem. This woman, Hagar, is a slave who would have been Sarah's handmaid. Now, this isn't a woman he was supposed to bring back with him. It's never a good move, dudes, to bring another woman home ever, right? Ever. That's not going to help the family dynamics. That's not going to help what's happening. And at first, she lived with them as a servant of Sarah's. But after some time of not seeing Sarah become pregnant, Sarah says to Abraham, why don't you just sleep with my handmaid? Have a baby with her. And then the baby will be considered ours. It'll be kind of like this adopted child. And Abraham, being the great man of faith that he was, basically just says, okay, right? Hagar gets pregnant, has a son. His name is Ishmael. How do you think that worked out for Sarah? We know it didn't go well, right? She wasn't happy. She got what she asked for, but she's absolutely miserable. And as we have seen in Galatians, that brings home the truth that you cannot accomplish on your own in the flesh what God has promised to do through the Spirit. That was Galatians chapter 3. After much heartache and pain, they figure it out. So she sends Hagar away earlier in Genesis. She sends Ishmael away. God meets Hagar, gives her a promise that he will protect her and tells her to go back to where Abraham was. She did. Ishmael still grows up, has a bond with daddy, and right now in the story, he's somewhere between 15 and 17 years of age, so he's a teenager. Isaac's around 2 to 3 years old. And as the party is beginning, Ishmael, the son of the servant girl, begins mocking Isaac. Some people have even read, theologians have read, perhaps even abusing him in some sort of way. Kind of laying the smack down. You can see it. You know, teenagers like to wrestle, even if it's a 3-year-old, right? 93-year-old Mama Sarah, who has been waiting her whole life to have a child, is not going to let this thing happen. So she kicks them out. It says there in verse 10, so she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her, for the son of the slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. She says, get rid of her. And this is that area in Galatians that we just read, Galatians chapter 4, verse 30. Get rid of her. And you'll notice Sarah doesn't even give Hagar the decency of her name. She says, just get rid of the slave woman. She doesn't have a name. Get rid of her son. He doesn't have a name either. This is totally derogatory on Sarah's part. It's hard to blame Sarah for feeling this here because she's wanting to protect her son. She gets to the heart of it when she says, this son of a slave is not going to be an heir with my son. There's no way he's going to have an inheritance with my son. And that was the circular big issue in the family at this moment. So she casts them out. They are slaves. They are cast out. They don't fit the mold of this family. Let's just cast them out. They are different than us, Abraham. Cast them out. He is going to be like a wild donkey, is what actually had been prophesied about. Kick them out. They are from another country, Egypt. Kick them out. You slept with her. Kick them out. And it makes sense to some degree. If you're sharing a tent with your husband, right? Your son, his other lady, and her son, someone's getting kicked out, right? That's what's happening here. It's not ideal. And if some of you think that you came from a dysfunctional family, just look at the scenario here in the Bible. It is dysfunctional with a capital D. It doesn't make it right. It just means the Bible is filled with families full of dysfunction. It is filled, the whole Bible, with jacked up families because people are jacked up. Often we approach the Bible or the people in the Bible and we look for like kind of the focus on the family moment with them. This isn't a focus on the family moment here. They're not your parenting heroes. Most of the time as you look at scripture, you just look at them and go, wow, that's jacked up. Wow, they messed up. And that's exactly right. They're not parenting heroes. As a matter of fact, show me a family that has more than one verse written about them in the Bible that had it together as a married couple and as a family. It's really hard to do. You can't. You could have like 19 kids and counting with the most intentional parenting, the most moral virtues, and you're still going to have issues because the people in the family are sinful and we sin against one another. About 17 years has passed. And they are still dealing with that moment where they didn't trust God and his promise when Hagar went in, or Abraham went in to Hagar. Now, how does Abraham feel about this? How's this going to go down? And the thing, verse 11, was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. All right. This is displeasing to Abraham. 2 women, 2 sons, and now he has to choose? This is painful. Imagine choosing between your 2 sons. Abraham loved Ishmael. Chapter 17 said he even pleaded with God at one point that Ishmael would be the child of promise. That Ishmael, he says, that Ishmael might live, that Ishmael might be the inheritance. This is why, just a sidetrack, this is why when God created marriage, he designed it as 1 man, 1 woman, and 1 lifetime, okay? For the conflicts that we see even right here. This is why both Jesus and Paul echoed that statement that I know is not popular in our culture today, 1 man and 1 woman for 1 lifetime. Most, if you're married, would say, yeah, 1 man, 1 woman, 1 lifetime, that's stressful enough, right? Anything outside of that is what Abe is facing here, and it's displeasing. There's more anguish, more stress, more complexities, and more sin against each other. Some people, maybe even here, right now, in this room, have been contemplating something outside of 1 man, 1 woman, and 1 lifetime. Maybe it would be better with someone else. You know where that ends? It's displeasing. So here is this family that is being used by God, and their life is super messy right now. And Abraham is like, no, I don't want this to happen. This isn't happening. We're not going to cast them out. Then God shows up. Verse 12. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. What does God say? You know what God says? Listen to your wife. Every woman is highlighting. Interesting, because a few chapters back, he listened to his wife when she said, go sleep with Hagar. Now, he doesn't want to listen to her in this moment. You see, ladies, men have very selective hearing, right? You probably know this. We listen when we think it benefits us. And that's not just men, that's everyone, right? But God says what? Listen to her. Listen to her. This is huge. And I appreciate this here. Sarah wasn't in some chauvinistic, macho culture where she as a woman had no say at all in this relationship. She had total freedom, often, to talk with her husband about any issue that they were facing. And you know what? Abe didn't really always agree. Now, I know this is going to be revolutionary here because everyone in here has a perfect marriage where you never disagree. But for the rest of us, there are going to be times when you don't agree with your spouse. You want something he doesn't. Right? I sit in marriage counseling all the time, and this is the back and forth that always goes down. He wants something you don't, or you want something he doesn't. So who ends up getting what they want? You know what the answer is here? God. God steps up. God does. God intervenes. She makes a request. Abe disagrees. God comes in and has to change Abraham's heart. Ladies, there's going to be times where you just can't change his heart. You can't even influence him. You can't change him. But when we're talking communication, you absolutely need to pursue that, especially if it's an unbiblical thing. This is mutual companionship. In Ephesians, it talks about submitting yourselves one to another. A lot of people like to just jump to, wives, submit to your husbands. It first says, submit yourselves one to another. And men, we got to listen. We may not agree. So what do? Ultimately, God wins here. God interjects what he wants. And as couples, when there is disagreement, man, give each other the space to seek God. Ladies, give your husband space if you don't agree with him to allow God to work and trust and pray that God will lead him. And if he does make a bad choice, remember, God's bigger than his choices. God pursues. And you're not trusting your husband, you're trusting God. God says, look, whatever your wife says, Abraham, you go do it, right? Now, God is essentially saying, it's okay for you to start to plan this direction, but I'm going to get in here and I'm going to make a change. So he says, get rid of this slave family. Now, sounds harsh. Sounds brutal. Why? Because there is something much more massive taking place here than just family dysfunction. God says it's through Isaac that your offspring will be named. God says, I'm choosing, electing to work through Isaac. Now, Paul has been preaching this in Galatians, and he also says this in the book of Romans, chapter 9, verse 6, where he says, it is not as though the word of God has failed, for not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel, and not all are children of Abraham because they are his offspring. But through Isaac shall your offspring be named. This means that it is not the children of the flesh, Ishmael, who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as offspring. For this is what the promise said, about this time next year I will return, and Sarah shall have a son. God chooses to work his redemptive promise, that's very important, through Isaac, not Ishmael. Meaning, Christ would come, the offspring, through Isaac, not Ishmael. Now, there is a huge religious debate over this story right here, where Isaac would become kind of the father of the Jewish people, and Ishmael would become kind of the father of many of the Arab nations. The Arabs that follow the teachings of Muhammad, they changed this whole section in the Quran, and they say that Isaac was sent away and Ishmael was accepted. Ishmael was then also offered as a sacrifice, not Isaac. Jews and Arabs and Christians have fought over who the promise was given to for hundreds of years. And I just want you to comprehend this. Much of the international turmoil that we face today in the Middle East is an old family feud because Abraham slept with 2 women and had 2 sons. That's massive. Do you know how mind-boggling that is? Listen to me. Imagine the Middle East if Abraham keeps his pants on or girds up his loins, right? Imagine that. How many wars have been fought? How much blood has been shed? How many billions of dollars spent on this international conflict that came from 2 people that didn't trust the promise of God? That's huge. Some of us might think, what's the big deal? He slept with her. It's culturally acceptable. That's such a small understanding of how the actions play out and the consequences play out of what we do. Now, I know a lot of you, trust me, it'll be chaos. If you say, look, I simply just want to go have sex with her or them, which the Bible calls a good thing in the confines of marriage. But here we see this massive, massive consequence of what happened with Abraham. Now, if the story just stopped there, then we develop an anti-Arab mentality. A lot of Arabs feel that way from both Jews and Western Christianity. But we need to notice here, this is the point today. How does God actually end up treating Ishmael and Hagar? How does God end up treating this product of the flesh? How does God end up treating the outcast? How does God treat the one that is rejected? Look at what it says. Verse 13. He says, I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. It's not that God was simply going to bless Isaac and abandon Ishmael. No, he says what? I'm going to bless Ishmael as well. He's going to be an amazing nation. Messiah won't come through him, but he's going to be great. Are the Arab nations great? They're massive, right? They are cared for and loved by God. Why? Because God so loved the world. God is kind to those who are lost. God is kind even to the outcast or to the orphan. God is kind to those that have been rejected and despised. That nation is one of the wealthiest people groups on the planet. We don't serve a God that loves Jews and simply hates Arabs because of their lineage. This isn't Isaac's a good boy and Ishmael is bad. Actually, they're both equally sinners. But yet God chooses to work through Isaac's line to get to Jesus, but he blesses and he cared for both. So God says, Abraham, do what Sarah says, but in doing so, trust me, I got him. Have faith that I'm also going to take care of your son. What happens? So Abraham rose early in the morning, took bread and a skin of water, and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. This is hard. Abe just now sent this single mom and her son out into the wilderness with a couple gallons of water and some bread. Now, some of you have maybe been treated like that. You're in a family like that. Maybe you are a family like that. There's no support, no help, no dad, no husband. You felt abandoned. You felt like an outcast. What's even harder about the story is Abe's a rich man. He has lots of wealth. He loves his son, but he acts like a deadbeat dad. Why doesn't he give him more? It would be easy to look at this and say that Abe is not just, and that's possible. He's not a perfect man. We know that about this guy, Abraham. But there's something going on much deeper in the story, is that he is literally trusting God because God told him he was going to take care of him. He has learned to trust God. God said he would provide, and he will. God said he would take care of him, and he will. So he sends her out, and she wanders in the wilderness of Beersheba. And then verse 22 says down into Paran. Do you know where these places are? These are in Saudi Arabia. Paran is essentially Mecca, which is the same region where a descendant of Ishmael would come by the name of Muhammad. Think about it. No Ishmael, no Muhammad. No Hagar, no Muhammad. God forgives sins. God makes us saints. But man, the consequences of sin, they hurt for thousands of years. They hurt. What does it say in verse 15? When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, oh, this is brutal. Let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and she wept. That's heart-wrenching. I cannot imagine a worse fate than to sit beside and watch your son die. She's been kicked out of her house. She's done all she can do. They're out of water. She lays him down under a bush. She takes off a ways away from him, and her prayer isn't God save. Her prayer is, I just can't watch him die. This is sad. This is the brokenness of sin in families. This is what it looks like to be an outcast. She's flat broke. This is what it felt like for her to be a slave, to be a minority, to be rejected from her family, to not have a vote, to be left for dead. And then something happens. Something happens. This is what I love about the story of God, is that whenever mankind seems to be without hope, God just shows up. And he shows up here. What does he do? And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of the Lord, or angel of God, called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." What does God call her? He calls her Hagar. Up until this point, she's just been labeled by society as a slave or as a woman. Even though the circumstances are hard, she is now beginning to hear her name called by God. She's experiencing an element of freedom. How about the boy? Do you remember what Ishmael's name means? Ishmael, his name means God hears. In this moment of desperation, God heard his cries. God heard the voice of the outcast. God heard the voice of the downcast. God heard the voice of the oppressed. He heard the voice of the one that was in bondage. Some of you may be in that situation and you feel like the outcast, and because of that, you are downcast, you are depressed, and you are broken. You're broken because you're a slave to something. You're in bondage, and it is leading to death. And there is nothing you can do but lay down and die, it feels like. That's the last straw. You're done. Today, like Ishmael, wherever you may be, man, he calls out to God. And like Hagar, it's okay to shed some tears. Life does that to us. But listen, God heard. He heard. Here's the prayers of the single mother that might even be struggling in here today. He hears the prayers of the fatherless son. He hears the prayers of the broken. He hears the prayers of the defeated. He hears. And notice who it was that talks to her. It says it's the angel of God, likely a Christophany. This is Jesus. Jesus, the one who became man, the one that experienced the cross, where he would become the ultimate outcast, abandoned by his own father, the one that cried out for his father, and yet he felt forsaken. He's praying to his father, and he's not getting an answer. And in that moment, God is pouring out his wrath upon him for our sake. Jesus, the one that experienced the pain of losing a friend. Jesus, the one who had been betrayed. Jesus, the one that wandered this earth with no place to lay his head. Jesus, the one that says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give rest for your souls." Jesus, who spoke all things into existence. Jesus, who is supreme. Jesus, who calms the waves and the wind. Jesus, who multiplies food. Jesus meets Hagar. Jesus meets Ishmael. Jesus calls out to her. Jesus encourages her. Get up. Pick him up. I'm going to make him a great nation. He doesn't just tell her about hope. He also gives her water here in this story. He says, "Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy. Up, lift up the boy, and help him fast with your hand, for I will make him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skim with water and gave the boy a drink. He gives her water. He reveals this well to her. Possibly, this was miraculous. Also possible, she was so caught up in her grief and self-pity that she didn't see it. Sometimes it takes seeing Jesus for us to get our hands off our eyes in order for us to see the well that's maybe been there all along. Either way, Jesus does this for her. He opens her eyes, And I find this fascinating because Jesus had already sat with her the first time she was kicked out, and now he reveals this well of water to her at this time. Jesus also would meet another woman at a well. You know what she was? A Samaritan woman. A woman that had been through 5 husbands and a brutal relationship. She was now with someone that was not her husband, and she is surprised that Jesus would even want to talk with her. But listen, that's the character of Christ. Here is Hagar. She was a slave. She is a child with no present father. She's older, she's Egyptian, she's broke, she's homeless, she has no family, she has no one that wants her. And some of you, maybe you felt in that space. You may sit alone a lot. You may feel used. You may have been abused. You may not think anyone cares, but I'm telling you this, Jesus does. He really comes to the outcast. No one wants to be with Hagar, but Jesus does. No one wants Ishmael, but Jesus does. What others choose to cast out, Jesus says, come to me. That gives us a future and a hope because of him. Because God is a father to the fatherless. Jesus says, look, open your eyes. There is water right there. There is hope there. I have a promise for you as well. And he just lovingly, graciously cares for this outcast. Interestingly enough, it is this well, Muslims call the Spring of Zamzam, that they stop at all along the way when they are traveling to Mecca to celebrate how God provided for Ishmael. Yet they fail to see that provision came from the angel of God, Jesus, and they miss Jesus. Let me ask you today, how do we respond to the outcasts? Like, outcasts probably in Bend, Oregon, are probably how we view, like, Hunnell Road. Outcasts are those that we get on next door neighbor with, and we share our beef, and we get frustrated because they're not like us. How do we as followers of Jesus respond to the outcasts? And flip that, how has God responded to us? What if I name the outcasts? What if it's our view or perspective of like Arab nations or other religions, which you're going to get to talk tonight about at Pub Theology, setting this up for y'all, have fun. How do we treat Muslims? Some of us, our prejudices can run super, super deep. Just having this novel thought, that is, what if we treat them the way God treated their founding father? How did he treat Hagar? How did he care for Ishmael? He reached out to the outcast and saved his life. He blessed him. He loved him. He cared for him. What that means is that whatever our understanding of outcast is, or who we view as kind of like outside our sphere, right? How do you love and care for the outcast? How do we treat or post about who the Christian world deems as an outcast? I'm not saying agree with their sin, but how do we treat them? How does God treat them? He pursues, he cares, he loves, he saves. It says in verse 20, and God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness, became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. God was with this boy. Is he a follower of God? We don't know. It's possible. The Bible doesn't say. But what we do know is that he was an outcast that God sought out, cared for him, provided for him, protected him. Do you know, this gives me hope. This is gospel right here. You may be cast out by a family. You may not be the promised one. You may not have the right lineage. You may be raised by a single mom. You may not be of the right nationality. You may have treated people badly even people of faith, even as he did to his own blood. There are so many things that cause you and I to be cast out, but God says, I'm calling you in. And he calls us to be family. He calls us from bondage to freedom. He calls us from something bleak to something great. And the truth is, we're all outcasts. Galatians 4 tells us we were all born of the slave woman. Under what? Bondage to the law, to sin and death. But because of Jesus, we have been born again in a supernatural way. We are children of promise. We are literally set free from the bondage of law and sin and death, and only in Jesus can we deal with that sin. Judaism can't deal with the sin issue. They will say, live a good moral life, be subject to the law, follow Father Abraham and Isaac. But the problem, as we've seen in Galatians, is we know, first of all, Father Abraham was not a good moral man. And the only place that leads us is to be under a curse. This is what Paul pushes back on for the final time here in Galatians, and we finish here this morning. He said this, you were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion is not from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. A lot of times we think leaven, we just equate it to sin. Literally, this is them trying to follow the law to be saved. If they try to put just a little bit of law in, it's going to be a problem. He says, I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view than mine, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever they are, whoever he is. But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, adding law, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. And here is some of Paul's most harshest words. I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. You were doing good, but you let the leaven in. You let the law back in. Then Paul drops his biggest bomb and he says, I wish you would just go cut yourselves. Literally, the terminology there is to castrate yourselves. They were wanting to talk about foreskin for salvation. He says, I wish they would take it a step further and just cut everything off. Those who have been castrated, this is why he says this, can't produce new converts that are like them. In a spiritual sense, those who are castrated cannot pass along their lies to a future generation. What is Paul kind of landing the plane on there in Galatians as they've been talking about circumcision for most of this book, right? He says, it can't save. The law can't save. Being in the lineage of Isaac can't save. Islam under Ishmael can't save, right? Their leader was a 17-year-old that beat up a 3-year-old. Muhammad himself was not a perfect man. Both of these say, follow our guys. But their guys were sinful. Their guys have lists that can't be attained. The goal is to get to the ultimate son of promise, and that is Jesus. The one that would take away the sins of the world, to believe our sin has been dealt with by the one who is perfect. Living this life knowing that is true, Paul says that is where your freedom lies. It's not about following a system. It's about having faith in the Son of Promise, who gives grace to the outcast like you and I. We don't come to him saying, I'm going to clean up my life. I will do this or that. We come knowing that he has accepted us and bled for us for who we were. Not for who he's just simply going to make us. He is our promise, and he is our hope. And now we worship him. Father, this morning we thank you for being kind to those of us who know we are truly outcasts. And until we understand how outcasts we are, we can't see how good you have been to us. And so we praise you for pursuing us. We praise you for loving us. We praise you for caring for the outcast. And not just caring for the outcast, but Jesus, you experienced what it's like to be an outcast. To the fullest extent. Rejected by your friends, taking on what felt like the rejection of your father, declaring, "Why have you forsaken me?" That makes you a great high priest to all of us who have felt like an outcast. That we can go to you and you can tell us you know and you understand. And so we come to your table this morning celebrating that we are no longer cast out, but we are children of promise, heirs of God. We receive from you. This time the tables are open. We invite you to come to the table to celebrate the body, the blood of Christ, to be reminded that this is how you entered in, was because he was cast out. So if you're a follower of Jesus, we invite you to come to the table to partake of him, to celebrate the grace that he has freely given to you. And let's just continue to celebrate him with these last few songs. We're going to sing, we're going to praise him because he has brought us in.